Hello, my name is Monet, and I am your host of Winding Through Time, the podcast that travels through time to explore different people, places, and events while pairing these facts with wine. Join me as I explore how one U.S. president attempted to interrupt a televised revolution. Tune into this episode of Winding Through Time as I explore the revolution will not be televised. Welcome back to Winding Through Time. I'm your host, Monet, and I'm so glad you decided to join me for my newest episode of Winding Through Time. I know it's been a while, but I thank you for your patience. I've been working on some things, so thank you for your patience and thank you so much for joining me this evening. I know every episode I say that I enjoyed working on this episode, but I really, honestly, really enjoyed working on this particular episode. And I really hope that you enjoy listening as much as I did creating it. So, the title of this episode is The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. And this is actually the title of a poem and song written by Gil Scott Heron. The original recording appeared on his 1971 album, Small Talk at 125th and Lenox. And Scott Heron would re record the song with a full band, and it would appear as a B side to his single Home is Where the Hatred Is. Now, in this song, Gil Scott Heron argues that change cannot be accomplished from the comforts of your own home. The first stanza says, "You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised." Now, watching week documentaries this about 2 weekends ago, I came across a revolution that was intentionally not televised, and the president responsible for it. So, this untelevised revolution would take place at the 1964 National Democratic Convention, and this occurred 5 years before Gil Scott Heron's song dropped. This incident would involve a group called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, Mississippi's quote unquote regular Democratic Party, and President Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, before I dive into the incident, let me provide you with some background information on the MFDP and the events that led up to the convention. And I must totally give credit to SNCC's digital library. I I ran all through there researching, and I really encourage you guys to take a look at it. They have a wealth of resources and information on this site, and it's amazing. You can spend hours getting lost in the documents and all of the information. So, a lot of this information came from those resources available on that website. And I really highly encourage you to go take a look, and you'll be amazed at the information that they have there. And y- hopefully, you find it as intriguing as I did. So let's go down to Mississippi. It's 1964, and SNCC, which is the acronym is short for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They joined forces with the NAACP, the SCLC, and CORE to create Freedom Summer in Mississippi. Now, in addition to those organizations, SNCC also worked with COFO, the Council of Federal Organizations. And COFO was a civil rights umbrella organization originally formed to support jailed freedom riders. COFO was designed to guide the flow of funds into Mississippi for voter education and registration and to protect and support grassroots activism in the state. And believe it or not, COFO was one of the more well known organizations in Mississippi. A lot of the citizens or the residents there recognized COFO, more than they did SNCC and the NAACP. So during this time, the Democratic Party was mostly white, and they were referred to as the Dixiecrats. And they called them the Dixiecrats due to their belief in racial segregation and their fight to keep Jim Crow laws intact. COFO held voter registration drives, but they weren't as effective as they would have liked for them to be. They did increase the number of Black votes, but the increase was not significant enough to make a substantial change. So Kofo went back to the drawing board and they began strategizing new ways to challenge the traditional Democratic Party and increase political involvement in the Black community. The first part of this plan was to organize a registration drive. And they did that, and the drive was meant to prove if provided a safe means and environment, Blacks would vote because there was an assumption that Blacks didn't vote and they didn't want to vote. In addition to the drive, COFO would challenge the Democratic Party through the development of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So this two-part plan, first the registration drive and then challenging the Democratic Party, um, they began to formulate this. And this party, this was going to be open to all races, socioeconomic levels, and this will challenge the majority white Democratic Party at the state and national level. So the MFDP would challenge the system by trying to get its delegates seated at the upcoming National Party's convention. Now, you might be wondering how a mostly Black grassroots party would challenge the mighty Dixiecrats. Well, the MFDP didn't have a literacy requirement. I mean, they registered members in public places and they welcomed both Black and white members. They used volunteers to build their membership and organize meetings at the local and regional level. And this organizing would lead to the election of delegates at their state convention. So at their state convention, they had about 2,000 farmers, housewives, day laborers, ministers, poor people, middle class people, people from all walks of life. They would gather at a Masonic temple in Jackson, Mississippi, and there they elected 68 delegates. They would be led by Lawrence Guidon as the chair and Fannie Lou Hamer as vice chair. And the election of these delegates was the first step. The courage to draft and present a platform that would challenge the Dixiecrats would be another thing. That's their next step. So it would take energy, influence, and power to battle this white power structure. And the MFDP had Victoria Gray, Hazel Palmer, and Fannie Lou Hamer. So if you're not familiar with these individuals, I definitely would suggest that you look them up because these were some heavy hitters. Definitely, they would need them and more in order to challenge the Dixiecrats. So at the time, Mississippi was a one-party state. And I mean, it was controlled by the Democrats, and they were mostly, well, not mostly, they were all white, middle, upper class citizens. The Mississippi Democratic Party was home to politicians like Governor Ross Burnett, who encouraged whites to riot and kill when James Meredith integrated Ole Miss. So this just gives you an idea of what they were up against. The delegates were selected, the platform was established, and the stage was set for the MFDP to challenge the system. Would the DNC allow the Dixiecrats to maintain the power they gained through intimidation and terror? Or would they allow the MFDP, who represented all citizens regardless of race, socioeconomic status, and gender, to represent the state? This was a challenge to recognize all citizens. And when the MFDP delegates arrived in DC, they were ready to send a message and ready for a fight. Now, in order to land the first punch, people like John Lewis, Ella Baker, Snick, and Core began contacting party officials and convention delegates to secure support. The Dixiecrats were also preparing, and this made President Lyndon Johnson nervous. Now, President Johnson was very confident he would cruise to victory, but he didn't want to risk the embarrassment of having a public split in the party. President Johnson knew the Dixiecrats would never agree to the MFDP being seated, and that split he feared would be all but certain. So President Johnson did what he did best, and he used the Johnson treatment. And if you're not familiar with the Johnson treatment, you definitely have to look it up. He used that quite a bit. It was very intimidating. He was a very big man, and he could be very intimidating. So he used this treatment. He began to throw his weight around, and suddenly that slight support for the MFDP, it began to fade a little. Their support might have been fading, but that wouldn't stop the MFDP because all they needed were 11 and 8. Remember that, 11 and 8. So 11 votes would force a minority report supporting the MFDP's challenge, and 8 votes would require the minority report to be debated and voted on in front of everyone. So the battle for those 11 votes began. It was the MFDP's chance to prove their case to the Credentials Committee. Now, the committee chair tried to keep this meeting under wraps, but he was blocked, and the MFDP's testimony would be televised. The MFDP's chairman was in jail, so the vice chair, Fannie Lou Hamer, would testify in his place. In front of television cameras and under the glaring eyes of Americans, Fannie Lou Hamer began to slowly tell a story, her story, and the story of several Mississippians. In her story, Miss Hamer described how she endured beatings, threats, and violations of her human rights just so she could vote. In front of America, she asked, "If the Freedom Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because we want to live as decent human beings in America?" This Mississippi sharecropper was delivering a powerful testimony that would touch the hearts and minds of everyone watching. And that's exactly what President Johnson did not want. President Johnson called an impromptu press conference to announce, well, nothing really. He just didn't want anyone to hear what she had to say. So President Johnson determined the revolution would not be televised that day. No one would be moved to enter into a new social order based upon this captivating testimony. Oh, no. No one would be inspired by this revolution because it would not be televised. Or so he thought. The networks, they had other ideas, and they aired that testimony that evening in its entirety. They aired it in prime time, and they also featured it in the Sunday paper. And after part of this revolution was televised, the chaos ensued. Supporters of the movement flooded the convention headquarters with telegrams and calls. President Johnson's operatives would go back and forth with the MFDP and the Dixiecrats negotiating a deal on the delegates. Now, mind you, this is happening before if the first official day of the delegation. So this is just pure chaos occurring right now. One of the deals that they're trying to strike would provide the MFDP with the opportunity to attend the convention so they could show their support for President Johnson. However, their delegates would not be seated. And as you can guess, the MFDP rejected it. Another deal would seat equal number of delegates from the MFDP and the Dixiecrats. And as you might be able to guess, the Dixiecrats and the White House rejected that. Deals and ideals went back and forth with no agreement made. Behind the scenes, it was getting heated because leaders of different civil rights groups, they weren't in agreement as to how the MFDP should proceed. Some leaders like Bayard Rustin wanted the MFDP to compromise, and some leaders were afraid if they supported the MFDP, their funding would be affected. So by Sunday, the votes of the 17 members in favor of the minority report had been secured, and the committee chair knew it. So how did he deal with this? He postponed the vote and created a subcommittee to look into the matter. Now, while they were on the inside stalling the vote, protesters were gathering on the outside. When I tell you it was pure chaos, it was pure chaos. Now, the testimony was only the first part of the revolution. This is also a part of the revolution. So don't think that testimony was it. No, all of this is a part of this revolution. You had Northern supporters and local supporters joined with the families of slain civil rights workers to protest in support of the MFDP. Now, in the midst of the singing and speeches, protesters carried large pictures of the 3 civil rights workers who were slain in Mississippi. The burned remains of the station wagon that they were abducted from was even on display for all to see. So the next day was opening day of the Democratic National Convention. All of this occurred before the opening. And as most delegates were preparing for the opening ceremony, MFDP leaders, liberal wing leaders, credential committee members, and prominent civil rights leaders were gearing up for the fight of their lives. Hubert Humphreys was a liberal member of the Democratic Party who initially agreed to support the MFDP. But when his political future was threatened by President Johnson, he backtracked. Humphreys even tried to convince the MFDP to abandon their demands by making promises of fair treatment and support at future conventions, but the MFDP wasn't having it. Ms. Hamer even told Humphreys that she had been praying about him and that he was putting politics over the rights of blacks. He was too afraid to do what was right, and for that, she was going to pray some more for him. So the MFDP's hopes did not solely rely on Humphreys, and the next day, the MFDP gained support when a congresswoman made a motion to the Credential Committee to seat the MFDP and regular delegates. The committee chair was not about to let that happen, so he stalled the vote, hoping to give President Johnson and his crew time to apply more pressure. Pressure was applied, and more chaos ensued. Jobs were threatened, positions threatened, business loans were threatened to be canceled. It just got ugly, y'all. And support began to dwindle, and the MFDP called another meeting. The MFDP leaders and leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others, they were once more asked to compromise. And in this offer, the Dixiecrats would be recognized as regular delegates, but they would not be seated unless they pledged to support the party's nominee. The MFDP would be allowed two at-large delegates, which would go to the leader of the Mississippi chapter of the NAACP and a white chaplain. The rest of the MFDP delegates, they could attend, but only as non-voting guests. A few additional proposed changes were part of the deal, but none would guarantee blacks the safe right to vote. So upon hearing this, the white chaplain, he offered to give up his seat to a black sharecropper, but the White House rules out that seat can go to leader Fannie Lou Hamer as his replacement. I mean, and this is although Fannie Lou Hamer, remember, she's the highest ranking member present because the chair is in jail. But President Johnson specifically did not want her serving as a delegate. There's also more research that goes into that, but I'll let you all go on the website and look at that, what was supposedly said about her by President Johnson. So a heated debate ensued, and some members felt that they accomplished something by getting them to even offer anything at all. I mean, to get them to negotiate was an accomplishment. That's what some of the members felt. But the majority of the MFDP disagreed, and they declined the offer. In the words of Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, they didn't come all that way for two seats. So while the MFDP was meeting about the compromise, guess what? The Dixiecrats were also in an uproar. They refused to support President Johnson as the Democratic candidate. So they left. Yep. They packed their bags and left the convention. And when they left, the seats slated for them were now empty. But those seats would not stay empty for long. So pro-MFDP delegates began passing their convention passes to MFDP delegates so they could make their way to the convention floor. So one by one, the MFDP delegates snuck onto the convention floor and filled the empty seats left by the regular Mississippi delegates. I told y'all chaos ensued. Soon the security guards caught wind to what was happening and they removed them all. So the next evening, the MFDP delegates planned to occupy the abandoned seats again. But this time the chairs had been removed from the area. The lack of chairs, however, did not deter the delegates, and once again, they took to the floor, only this time they stood. On the DNC floor stood sharecroppers, farmers, housewives, ministers, the poor, middle class, blacks, and whites from the South. Their mere presence defied the norms but their determination to be recognized and included in a political system not meant for them was groundbreaking and honestly absolutely beautiful. They stood there and they watched President Lyndon Johnson receive the nomination for president and Hubert Humphreys receive the nomination for vice president. And then they went home. Now, although they did not get the outcome they wanted, the movement did not die on that convention floor. The white Mississippi delegates would go on to support Johnson's challenger, Barry Goldwater. Now, Barry Goldwater lost, but the support of the Dixiecrats would start a trend of white Southern Democrats switching to the Republican Party. The MFDP was bitter about how they were treated at the convention, but they still campaigned for Johnson. They made it to the convention floor, but they couldn't get any African Americans elected to office. Not enough blacks were registered to swing any race. All parties walked away from this convention changed. The white delegates no longer trusted the Democratic Party. The MFDP didn't trust the government or the Democratic leaders. The liberal Democrats were upset with the MFDP. Things changed. These changes would ignite a shift in the political landscape and alter the direction of the fight for voting rights. Now, I could go on and on and on about all of the changes that occurred amongst each group, but time does not permit, and I will definitely return to this topic during a different show. But I want you to think about something. The term revolution means a sudden, radical, or complete change. And although this revolution was not fully televised, it did occur. And so tonight's episode calls for a glass of 2020 Chaos Theory. Now, this is a red blend wine that is produced by the Brown Estate Vineyard, which is located in Napa Valley, California. And this is actually a Black-owned winery that produces various wines. They have Zinfandels, Cabernet Sauvignons, Chardonnays. They have all sorts of varieties. And you can order this wine online, but I purchased my bottle at my local Total Wine and More. So I would imagine you should be able to find a bottle at your local wine shop. It cost about $39. I believe it was a sale. So I see it kind of ranges between $38 and $44. So expect to spend that much. And you will need your wine opener for this bottle. So the appearance of this wine is a deep garnet color. And it doesn't have a pronounced smell. It's a very has a very delicate smell of blackberries, cocoa, and when I first smelled this, I thought I was a little crazy, but I smelled again, and it's like a slight smell of tobacco. To me, I smelled it. Let me know if you smell it as well when you pour your wine and you give it a little swish, swirl, a little swirl, not swish, but let me know if you also smell a little bit of that tobacco. This is a medium bodied wine that is honestly a little chaotic. I chose the wine for the title and because it's from a Black-owned vineyard, but this wine is a little chaotic. And I say that because it changes on your palate. It starts with an oak taste, but it ends very smoothly. I got a nice taste of plums and blackberries, and it's a little acidic, and it does have a lasting taste, which means that the taste lingers in your mouth for a while after you drink it. And this wine would pair very well with steak or lamb. So it's a very nice wine. It's very complex. So be prepared for that. How they say, how it goes down is not how it ends. It starts one way and ends another way. So it's a little chaotic, but I did enjoy this wine. I will buy another bottle just to age it because I'm quite sure the longer as this wine ages, excuse me, I'm just quite sure it'll be simply delicious. So I do plan to purchase another bottle. So with that being said, pour a glass of wine and join me every Wednesday as I explore historical events and the wines that relate to them. Now, I know we like to keep a good thing to ourselves, but I am asking you to share this good thing, this awesome podcast with one or two friends. Invite them to join us next Wednesday and let them know this is not your average history lesson. Make sure you follow, subscribe, and visit me on my social media accounts. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at whining_through underscore through THRU underscore time. You can also follow me on Facebook at Whining Through Time, and be sure to check out my episodes on YouTube now at Whining Through Time, the number 2. Thank you for joining me this evening, and I will see you next Wednesday for Whining Through Time.